A few years ago, I decided I was going to make my way through this book, Gandhi's autobiography. And I wanted to do that because I had seen the movie, and in it, it highlighted the most amazing things. There was the long march to the sea, where they created salt. They boiled seawater and made salt. And then there was that famous scene where they walk up to the salt factory, and one by one, they're cut down. And then near the end, he goes on this extensive hunger strike, and he's so close to death. And eventually, the people decide to settle for peace. So I thought, I want to know what Gandhi's perspective on all of that was. So I began reading the book, and as you can expect, the first little bit was about his education, and then his training. And as the book went on, there were fewer and fewer pages for all these epic events to happen in. In fact, the book highlighted almost none of them. But what the book did talk about was all the work that Gandhi did beforehand. He calls it his experiments with truth. He experimented with things. He decided, it would be good to be musical. So he picked up a violin and started practicing. He decided that, we are all interconnected, therefore he should become a vegetarian and eventually a vegan, only living on nuts and fruits. So what the book highlights, though it isn't the big, spectacular, media-grabbing events, it's all the foundation that made those events possible. There was a lot of preparation for those events. And that's a little bit like our story for today. Preparation. Our story today is a little bit strange. It's a parable. Parable of 10 bridesmaids. And we're given very few details about these bridesmaids. We know that some are wise and some are foolish. And the foolish ones don't bring oil, and the wise ones do. They're going to a wedding. And the groom is late. And they're waiting, and they're waiting, and they're waiting. They all fall asleep. And around midnight, the groom comes, and they trim their lamps so that they'll burn brightly. But at that point, the 5 that didn't bring any oil realize that they're almost out. And so they ask the 5 that did bring oil, "Can we have some of yours?" And they say, "No." They say, "Well, maybe you should go off to the store. Maybe you should go off and buy some oil." So they head off to find oil, and the other ones, they go to the party. The ones who go to the store, they come back, and they say, "We've got oil now. Can we be let into the party?" Jesus says, "No," or the groom says, "No." Now, this parable raises some interesting questions. There are little details that we might get caught up on. Why 10 of them? Why are there 10 bridesmaids? We don't really know. There are 10 commandments. Does that mean there are 10 bridesmaids? Do they represent the commandments? I don't know. No one really seems to know. And the parable is especially hard to interpret because we don't know anything about first century wedding customs, really. There are 2 questions that seem to nag at this parable. The first one is, why wouldn't they share their oil? Because this is a parable that Jesus tells, right? Why wouldn't they share their oil? You would think that Jesus would inspire that kind of sharing, that kind of gratitude, but they don't, or at least not in this story. That is, if we're talking about oil, if we're actually talking about a flask of oil. But what if we're talking about something else, like study and preparation and good deeds? Those aren't exactly things you can siphon off and give to somebody else. But maybe even a more pressing question is, why wouldn't Jesus let them in? Because again, this is Jesus, and you would think that there was radical welcoming. But he doesn't. In scriptures, there's 3 different ways of knowing. There's knowing as you would your romantic partner. That you know somebody. That you have a knowing of somebody that only you have with them and they have with you. And then there's knowing as in, I know your face and your name. You are Louise and I am John, and we know each other. And then there's knowing as in the rabbinical sense. For a rabbi to know a student meant that the rabbi took the student on. And for the rabbi to not know a student meant that they were not student and teacher. So Jesus takes a look at these 5 people at the door, and he doesn't know them. He doesn't recognize them by who they are and what they've done. But let's not get too serious, because ultimately, they're preparing for a party. One commentator said, this isn't like they're preparing some extravagant feast, they're going to a party. And it's like their uncle has a salami under one arm and a bottle of wine under the other. They're going to a party, and the lesson is prepare to party. But there are different kinds of parties. Sure, they're the kind of parties that you go to from 8 o'clock to 12 o'clock. Gandhi's party was not an 8 to 12 party. Gandhi's party was freedom from the British Empire. Sidney Crosby's party was gold medal goal, Vancouver 2010. My party, the party I think of many people in the world, is one where we celebrate peace. So, rather than me sit up here and talk about it, why don't we hear a little bit of Pete Seeger?
Last night I had the strangest dream I never dreamed before. I dreamed the world had all agreed to put an end to war. I dreamed I saw a mighty room. The room was full of men, and the paper they were signing said they'd never fight again. And when...
Oh, it went away. Oh, do you want to sing it together? Yeah, let's sing it together, okay. I'm not going to start. And when the papers all were signed,
they all joined hands and bowed their heads, and grateful prayers were prayed. And people in the streets below were dancing round and round, and guns and swords and uniforms were scattered on the ground.
Good. Do you want to sing one? Do you want to sing the chorus? Yeah. No, I didn't. You're beautiful. That's the kind of party I want to be a part of. Can you imagine that the images that it paints are so evocative? For Gandhi to prepare, he spent decades refining, experimenting, meditating. For Sidney Crosby, he spent hours and hours and hours skating, puck handling, hearing feedback, trying again, practicing some more, again and again. If we're going to make this happen, what must we do? I think this button symbolizes it all. To remember is to work for peace. And this button hinges on this central premise, that almost all violent conflict happens out of a deep-seated problem. So, what were the examples? What were the root causes of World War II? They started 2 decades earlier, at least, when a bunch of people sat in Paris and wrote a treaty. It was at Versailles. And they sat in Versailles and they wrote a treaty. And their treaty had all of these conditions on it that essentially crushed Germany. And so for 2 decades, the Germans lived under this treaty. If I recall correctly, there are pictures where people are taking wheelbarrows full of money down the street because inflation is so high. Or how about Rwanda? 4 months, 1994. We don't know how many people died. We guess around 800,000. And what were the root causes of Rwanda? 2.5 centuries of colonialism. You had your empires, England, France, Spain, Portugal, the Netherlands, all carving up the world into little pieces that they controlled. And finally, when they were done with it, they threw it back, took a map, arbitrarily drew lines around it, and said, here's a country, try and figure out how to work together. How about what's going on in Iraq and Syria right now? What are the root causes of that? A century of greed around oil, of meddling in politics, of training other people and interfering. Well, of course, we're going to end up with something like this. But if we're going to prepare for peace, we may not see the benefits of it 50 or 100 years down the line. We might if we're lucky. To work for peace means granting every single human being on this planet access to education, to health care, to sanitation, to food and clean drinking water. Working for peace means that this growing income inequality that we've got going on begins to shrink. Working for peace means funneling tens of billions of dollars that we spend on military improvement every single year to something other than fighter planes. Working for peace means getting involved in nonviolent direct action. Working for peace means having a say in the political process, making your vote count so those things can happen. Working for peace means praying, developing discipline that says when something happens, we're not just going to react, we're going to think, and we're going to discern about it. I met this man in England a summer or two ago, name of Ben Griffin. He fought in Iraq, and when he came home from his first tour, he said, I cannot go back. I simply cannot go back. He told this one story of parachuting in for a very targeted raid. They stormed into the house, and there were children in the house. And he said the terror on their faces made me feel like I was becoming what I was trying to destroy. Every time we put a bomber into the sky to shoot at targets that we cannot see, that we do not know, we are preparing for war for the next generation. Every time we train soldiers and desensitize them, we are preparing for war for the next generation. Anytime we spend billions of dollars on shipbuilding for ships that won't be ready for decades, we are preparing for war. And that's not getting us any closer to the party that Seeger talks about. So do we want to remember? Do we really want to remember? Do we want to remember all of those people who were shipped overseas, some of them 17, 18, 19 years old? How young is that? Do we want to remember them? Do we want to remember all of those people who come back from Afghanistan, PTSD like we've never seen? Do we want to remember those memories that many people live throughout their lives after they've gone to war? If we want to remember them, then we must work for peace.